Good morning, everybody. For those of you who have already heard Professor de Mambro Santos speak, you know that I'm going to be very short because he has so much to share with us. But for those who have not heard him before, he's one of our most knowledgeable and popular speakers. He received his bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Rome, his doctorate from the University of Bologna, the oldest university in Europe, and then did postgraduate work in Florence. He taught for 12 years at the University of Rome in the art history department. And when he came to the United States, he organized a wonderful show here at the Hallie Ford Museum involving Renaissance art. And I don't want to take up any more time because he has so much to share with you. So please welcome Professor de Mambro Santos.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning. Can you all hear me fine? Can you hear me? Yes. Very good. It's always wonderful and a pleasure for me to accept an invitation from you. I feel that I am really part of the membership as well. We've been known each other for so long that I don't hesitate 2 seconds to say yes. And your co-director and president can tell you that it's true. Now, when I was planning about this talk, I thought at first to involve 4 Michelangelos. But then I realized that it was going to be something like 5 to 6 hours long. And since I am afraid that we don't have that amount of time, I keep it short to 2 Michelangelos. So indeed, I think that we have to explain a little bit before moving forward who are those 2 Michelangelos and how come that I'm considering them so important, so relevant. For some of you, you may recall that last year we talked about how a banana turned out to be art. Well, this year I would like to reverse the equation and to think about art not as a banana at all, but in that we have to take responsibility and to truly try to understand the value and the reasons why those works, they should not only be preserved, but they are still talking to us. They are still so eloquently stimulating for 21st century audiences as well. So who are the 2 Michelangelos? Well, one may be very well known to most of you, if not for all of you, is Buonarroti, the Michelangelo par excellence, the one who lived between 1475 and died in 1564 in a way that was unprecedented. In fact, he was the first artist to receive an oration, so to speak, a praise upon his death in which he was described not as a human, but Michelangelo più che umano divino, divine. So that tells us a lot about his own fortune among contemporaries. The other one is quite the opposite. He was very poorly regarded, dismissively treated. He ended up in jail several times. In fact, trials, jail archives, they are the best source of information. And he ended up killing a man for which he had to flee from Rome, never to return as a living person. In fact, I'm talking about another Michelangelo, Merisi, better known as Caravaggio, due to the fact that he was born in a small town near Milan called Caravaggio. If you go to Milan, 15 miles north, there is this small village called Caravaggio. And he lived in the very end of the 16th century. He was born probably around 1571. We are unsure, but we know that he died, killed on a beach near Rome in 1610. Not even 40 years old. And those are masters very often associated with 2 categories, Renaissance and Baroque. While I, as an art historian, I keep repeating to my students, use categories with attention, with caution, because they are all-encompassing. And in fact, as I am going to explain today, Michelangelo, or both Michelangelos, they are directly related to another movement, to another artistic tendency, what is called Mannerism. And now I know that in our current language, when you talk about Mannerism, there is a slightly, if not strongly, negative connotation. That was not the case in the 16th century. As I am going to argue, Mannerism or manners, they were considered the epitome, the most distinctive element, the inner talent of an artist. So to expose one's manner meant to expose one's deepest, most valid talent. Now, manner indeed comes out of an Italian word that was significantly, as a neologism, created in the beginning of the 16th century for something that we are still using. Manners as in table manners, a mode of behavior, a social practice. There are many treatises on how to behave in a socially appropriated manner, and the earliest ones, indeed, they date back at the very beginning of the 16th century. So in the very context in which young Michelangelo was being trained and was already practicing his works. The migration is very revealing from behavior to mastery. So the manner has become something that you couldn't learn. It was not something that you could be trained, but it was inherently associated with the self. If you did have a manner, it meant that you were born to become either a king or an artist. In other words, we are going to explore, therefore, those two Michelangelos in relation to this creative tendency. That's the reason I would like to explain also the second half of my title, the modernity of early modern art. By early modern, we usually refer to forms of art, artistic tendencies dating back the 14th up to the, depending on the narrative, 19th century, before everything that is going to be explored in France, and it's going to be called modern art. So from realism, impressionism onward. But in my views, there is something profoundly modern, something profoundly contemporary, indeed still stimulating, even in early modern art. Whence this kind of oxymoronic, self-contradictory title. So what is modernity, if anything else but the modern version of modernus? And nothing could be oldest for art history than the Latin designation, because many of the terms, the concepts that we are still using, mimesis, imitation, imitatio, they come from Latin. Modernus, in ancient treatises, meant current, something that was updated. What we would call nowadays contemporary. So whenever someone or something was praised or described as modernus, it meant that it was felt as the avant-garde, the ultimate novelty, something that was currently made, updated, indeed. So sorry? Oh, sorry, no, it was a mistake. Yeah. That's my bad habit. Imitation, for instance, it's one of the most defining elements of art according to a modernus sense. That is to say, art, no matter whether it's a painting, a sculpture, an architecture, is first and foremost an imitation of natural forms. And for centuries, it has become the leading force. So the closer a certain work was to natural forms, the better, the most perfect, the most harmonious. But then artists started struggling with this very notion, because if I am supposed only to imitate forms, well, I may as well transform myself into a mirror and I will be the artist. So the point is, how could I add something? When I'm imitating nature, I'm translating it according to my own talent, according to my own techniques, my own maniera, my own manner. And therefore they are going to praise as the differentiation, as the very distinctive element of the artist, inventio, the invention, the inventiveness, what I am going to add every time. So not only natural forms, but natural forms that are going to be immediately perceived as transformed, translated by an artist through their inventiveness. And ultimately, and that's the beginning of a modern approach to art as we intend it, something that is still to be defined, something ambiguous, a form of an exploration, was when those two words, they were somehow fused together in a third one. And in reference to Michelangelo Buonarroti, this word is going to be used for the very first time in art historical narratives. Expression. Now, it's an almost abused word nowadays, right? It's the expression of oneself. You have to express yourself, but that's the very beginning. When Michelangelo was creating his works, some they were just so new that people didn't know how, not even how to describe them, because they were no longer mere imitations of natural forms, but they were so clearly made up, invented, transformed elements that people didn't know how to describe them. What are the best words? Giorgio Vasari, one of Michelangelo's earliest biographers, he defined it. I don't know what is it that makes Michelangelo's work so distinctive, but there are two words. The first, they are the full expression of his manner. So they were expressive. And we're going to have, even in contemporary art, a full, at first, German-based movement called Expressionism, indeed. So those three elements, they can be seen in one of the earliest works by Michelangelo. I guess that most of you have already seen or heard about David. It is the very first public commission that Michelangelo received in his native town, Florence. So for a young artist, barely 26, well, it was a major deal. He had already carved in Rome the Pietà. And overnight, he had become a sensation. People wanted to have him. And because he was not born in, but associated with Florence, well, the city hall called him back. Please come, because you must finish this work. The gigantic work that, in fact, is going to be nicknamed the Giant. Giant, paradoxically, representing David, the tiny little pre-adolescent, right? So it is something very intriguing. I'm sorry. I promise that I won't do that anymore. It's just that with my students, I keep doing that. When he was thinking about the ways he could express something that hadn't been expressed about David, he had a tradition to look at. In fact, prior to Michelangelo, there was a very successful artist, Donatello, that at least 50 years prior to Michelangelo had already cast bronze, carved marbles depicting a very young, pre-adolescent David. Very appropriate according to the biblical description. So the physicality is more textual based. On the other hand, we have Verrocchio, who used to be a very, very praised master. And in fact, he was the trainer, the first master of Leonardo da Vinci. And Verrocchio had another version of David. Still young, no longer naked, but very appropriately dressed, and both, they have something that Michelangelo didn't carve. Goliath had. So what they are showing here is the victorious, the winner. So the fact has already happened. If you know the Bible, if you know the textual source, you know that something very cruel and unexpected happened, and he turned to become, indeed, surprisingly victorious. But what about Michelangelo's interpretation? We do know that at first he looked attentively to the tradition, and the earliest or oldest studies for his own David, they depict still a very much adolescent, David with the head of Goliath. So he was in a dialogue with former works. The novelty was not that expressive. And then, in fact, he decided to change altogether. And the preliminary drawing has turned out to become, for the first time in early modern art, we have not a little defenseless, almost victimized David, but a David who is strong, muscular, powerful, and in fact, he's not an adolescent at all. And Michelangelo made it a point to describe the genital in a way that it's not scandalous for the time, because of course it was filtered through those cultural and biblical elements, so it was a form of representation that expressed strength and therefore maturity. He is an adult. He thinks like an adult, regardless of the age. So in other words, he is expressing something that is pretty much the result of his own inventio, his own inventiveness. And of course, again, he has to do with the tradition. When he was preparing the drawings and thinking about the very length of the body, he did have a one of the most important traditions on his shoulder. This one, the measurements of the human body. And according to an architect in the 1st century in Rome, Vitruvius, the perfect body could be somehow transformed into a canon, a mathematically based canon. The whole body should be divided into exactly the same measure, and the unit would be the head. 8 times the head of the male body would correspond to a perfect, to a beautiful body. That's the canon that for centuries had prevailed. Michelangelo, of course, was aware of that, had used that same canon in many drawings, including also carved marbles, but not in this David, which makes us wonder why. Because, of course, we can't assume that he didn't know. He did. So the point is, why he decided not to use the canon, disruptively, unexpectedly breaking the rules, breaking a canon that everyone would be expecting him to follow. In fact, here, if you take the measurement of the head according to the Vitruvian parameter, you're going to find out that the body is the equivalent of 6.5 times of the head, which means, therefore, that those who are good in geometry and trigonometry, that the head is larger. Why that? Out of proportion. If I do have a scheme of representation that it's based on a system that it's very rational, I can just use it and make my own measurements, why should I refrain from using it? What are the intentions? Well, first of all, let's contextualize. When Michelangelo was invited to carve the statue, he was given a block of marble. There was the first time, because usually he would go to Carrara and he would pick up the very marbles that he intended to carve. No, here, not only he was given the whole gigantic block of marble, but this block of marble had been already partly carved by a previous artist who had received the commission of this same David from the City Hall of Florence, because he was a collaborator of late Donatello. So we're talking about a marble that had been bought by the City Hall around 1465 for approximately 40 years, stood there. No one knows exactly what happened, so the commission had come to a paralysis. But then, of course, Michelangelo had the responsibility to carve a previously carved marble, gigantic, with heads and legs and arms. So he did something absolutely brilliant. Because, of course, it is so compelling for you to look at the body as a natural form, he reversed it. He put it upside down. So the legs were literally standing above. And, of course, he was no longer seeing the body, but he was seeing through the marble, almost like an abstraction. And then he could see the forms that he wanted to carve through those other forms. And therefore he distinguished. And that's something that he describes extensively. Artists such as Michelangelo and Leonardo, for instance, they belong to a generation in which art is no longer a technique. It's no longer just a technique. It's no longer something that you can learn and reply or replicate. It's something associated to the expression and invention, which means that maybe the very audiences they are made for, they may be unaware and they may not even like the results. Therefore, artists started writing about their own art processes to justify, to explain, to somehow create their own platforms of reference. This is what I intend. This is my goal, and therefore you should look at my works accordingly. So that's very, very new. And the novelty here lies in the fact that the head is not only out of proportion, but for a very intentional manner. Look at the way there is an expressiveness absolutely unheard of in the face, in the head. You can almost imagine there is a turmoil, there is some kind of psychological dimension here. It's not only an icon, it's not only a frozen marble statue, but it feels and it makes you feel. Look at the eyes, preoccupied, tense, worried, reflexive. And look at the way Michelangelo strategically, he carved not only so sharply and clearly the eyes, but he carved in a way that it's absolutely unprecedented the pupils, as to condense the shadow. So even if the statue is gigantic, even from below, you can not only see, but I would dare say you are attracted to look at the eyes. The gaze is absolutely moving towards the eyes, the power of this new Gorgon, of this new Medusa, indeed. Why? Look at the brainstorming head. Literally, the hair looked like the epitome of a brainstorming moment. He's thinking. He is planning something that it's going to lead him, to the action, to the hands. So the hands are going to follow the intellect. Most of all, I have to think. The very first stage is to reflect and then to act accordingly. That's the very strength of David, and symbolically of any entities, groups, communities that could be metaphorically associated with David. And in fact, Michelangelo is going to not only enlarge the size of the head, but he's also going to strategically enlarge hands and feet. The extremes that are going to move, that are going to be the responsible for the very action. As we all know, David is going to conquer, to win out of Goliath through his intelligence. He's going to find a strategy. With his sling, he's going to throw the stone. The hand, therefore, must be equally strong. But it has to follow the intellect. Michelangelo is going to write a beautiful poem about that, claiming indeed that la man che ubbidisce all'intelletto, the hand that follows or obeys the intellect. Look at the vein. Oh my God, can I move here? It's not. Look at here. You can feel the beating heart. The blood is there. So it is truly alive. And look at the way it is unusually in a pose, almost as if the hand itself is about to move, to throw. But that's the point, about to. There is a sense of temporality that it's unprecedented. It's not after the win and the victory, but it's before. So theoretically, we don't know what may be happening. And so is the foot, for instance, particularly this one. It's ready, prompt to move. So it is something that Michelangelo has created, an in-between temporality. Not the action, but immediately prior to it, the planing. No wonder that this very statue, the giant, is going to be indeed, no matter if you look from behind, you are going to see this very preliminary stages of an action. Action that it's determined. It's, in fact, the consequence, and no longer the originating force, of the very thoughts. You have to think before doing anything. In fact, if you think of Goliath and the little David, what happens here is that in this equation, well, Michelangelo reversed the paradigm. And David looks the giant, not because of his muscles, not because of his physicality, but his strength lies on his intellectual power. And no wonder that this statue is going to be set, indeed, in the very, here in this area, to be closer, at the main entrance of the City Hall of Florence, because it's going to be immediately perceived and praised as the emblem, almost the incarnation, the embodiment of Florence itself. Why? Well, Florence was very small. It was not even an autonomous area. It was basically the lands owned by the Medici family. But they have grown exponentially powerful through the bank of the Medici family. And in fact, they had locations in different parts of the world. And those locations had created a network that was the very power of the Medici, hence Florence itself. Pretty much like David, small. Florence is tiny compared to Rome, to any other entity of the time, but it's strong. It can defeat. And in fact, it was there from 1510 approximately, a committee of artists were assembled so they could indeed try to decide where to locate the statue. Eventually, they are going to decide for the entrance of the City Hall. It's going to stay there until 1873. For those who have a certain familiarity with the history of Europe, and in particular the history of Italy, well, Italy was not Italy at all. It was a fragmentation of states, and each state was a duchy, or it was an entity, a kingdom, etc. Only between 1860 and 1861 and 1870, Italy has become a unified country. And then, of course, the first question, where is the capital? First Turin, because of the very presence of the army. But then they decided that Turin, it was just too north, and it has very little to share with the cultural history of Italy. Where comes Italian as a language? Well, according to primary sources, in fact, it was a commonplace to believe that the originating source was the Tuscan, and more specifically the Florentine. So Florence was elected as the capital of Italy. And it stood as the capital until 1871. That's exactly the date in which, interestingly, they're going to decide to remove the original statue from that area, from the open-air placement, and they're going to bring it to a newly built museum, the museum that was owned by the Academy of Fine Arts, where indeed it's placed to this very date. So if you go there, of course, you're not going to be alone with David. There are always crowds, and you have to make reservations months, sometimes years in advance. But it is interesting that at the very moment in which Italy had been unified and created as a political, as a society, then they decided to somehow to protect, to preserve the very symbols of that newly created political identity. And David has become, therefore, pretty much the epitome, little, like Italy itself, and yet metaphorically, economically, culturally powerful. At least that's the very idea that they intended to promote. And therefore, this is a work that is not only a masterpiece by Michelangelo. It's not only a work that indeed fully embodies the notion of Renaissance or rebirth of antiquity, but more properly, I think it is a very good example at the earliest stages, Michelangelo expressing his own maniera, his own intent, his own projects, his own manner, his own expression. And in fact, hence the creation of this term that still nowadays we tend to define certain tendencies of 16th and even early 17th century art as Mannerists, because they are still related to this ultimate goal of expressing one's ideas and ideals, even sometimes breaking the rules and the canon. And that's exactly what Michelangelo is going to do in Mannerists, by another, the second word that Vasari had come up with. If I am going to explain something that it's unprecedented, I have to come up with new words. And he didn't know how to describe this new anti-canonical canonicity, because it has become a canon itself, while somehow escaping from the canon. And the description is beautiful. A role that without being in the role and not outside the role changes the role. If you read Vasari's definition, mine is clearer. So just to tell you how convoluted it is, because the idea is, how can I describe something that is undescribable? The very uniqueness of a work. Vasari comes up brilliantly with this new expression, licenza, which nowadays has become a cliche. We talk about poetic license. Indeed, there is a new kind of freedom. I am not only supposed to illustrate a story, I am not only supposed or expected to represent David and Goliath according to the biblical narrative, but as an artist, you expect from me my own poetic views, my own translation, my own interpretation and expression. In a word, licenza is going to be the guideline of the 16th century art, which is so new. Because of course, then, what is the stimulating but also risky part of a licenza? Theoretically, it has no boundaries, no limits. Once you break the rule, you can break in many directions and continuously. So how can people reassess, readjust, and evaluate their own works? They broke the rules that eventually, I'm going as far as to claim, led to the banana we talked about. Because now we have to reposition ourselves. What is it that makes this and not that a work of art? What is it that makes it perfect? Something that I can learn at the school? Something that is related to a well-established canon? Or something that it is thought-provoking, it is disruptive, sometimes even annoyingly so, as many contemporary or modern art, they do. In fact, this, forgive me, I think that's the very birth of modernism. If I were to choose one work prior to all the Van Goghs, all the Claude Monets, that would be it. This is a work that it's usually described as tondo doni, pitti, because it is a tondo. It has a circular form, which is, and I shall explain briefly, absolutely unheard of. Michelangelo knew that in Florence there has been since the 14th century a tradition of painting religious images in a circular form, only in Florence. You can find in Venice, you can find in Flanders, you can find in Poland, only in 13th, 14th, 15th century Florence, not even in Siena. So tondo has become almost the embodiment of a certain Florentine-based je ne sais quoi, I don't know what. And in fact, it is made not for, but to Bartolomeo Pitti, one of the richest men in Florence. It was given as a gift. 90% of the works carved by Michelangelo, they were not paid commissions. Well, he got enough from the popes and from the emperors, so he was very generous in that. He gave continuously gifts for his best friends, but also strategically, as an artist, to the wealthiest families in town. Because therefore, they would, in revenge, somehow create this networking of protection. In the future, they shall remember that I have given them something, and without asking, I expect to be given something in return. Michelangelo here, he's using for the second time the tondo. One of his earliest surviving paintings prior to the Sistine Chapel is a tondo. And again, it is a tondo that was given to Agnolo Doni. And interestingly, it is a gift given to Doni, which in Italian sounds like gift. The very term dono, doni is the plural, so it's a given gift to the giver gift, or gifted. You use the tense. So here we have the first tondo, very new, but a painting nevertheless. What Michelangelo does next is absolutely unprecedented. He carves the sacred image, carves in a way that it's so alive, three-dimensional. It is not a full rounded statue, it is a relief, but look at the way, for instance, the Madonna's head goes beyond the frame, almost as if there is a reality in art that reality itself cannot contain. It moves beyond, and beyond is per definition the territory of art. Go in territories that no one has ever gone before. And in fact, Michelangelo here, he does something absolutely new. Look at the face of the Madonna. I agree with you, very Renaissance. It looks like a 2nd century Roman carved marble, or even prior to that. So it looks like antique, ancient. Okay, but then what Michelangelo does next, it's not. Look at Christ's face. It looks as if it is either emerging from a shadow, from an unknown darkness, or on the contrary, it's melting, fading, vanishing. And strategically, very important at this point, Michelangelo is following all the attributes for devotional purposes as well. It is a child, but a very sad-looking child, because he knows that in about 30 years, he's going to be crucified. And in fact, the mother knows as well, and as a premonition, she indicates the very area in which he's going to receive the wound from the Roman soldier. So all the gestures that look so natural, they are embodiments of narratives, of symbols. It's just that audiences at the time, they were so exposed to those symbols that they would immediately grasp them, not as only physicality, but as a visualization of something that was metaphorically important, that was devotionally relevant. But then something happens here. Look at this face. What do you see there? This is the protector of Florence, but also the cousin of the Christ, Saint John the Baptist. But look at the face. What else can you see in this face? Alongside and within the face, the hatchings, the lines. You see Michelangelo's hand, literally at work. You see not only the carved work, but the carving process. The process is in the work. The work depends and also records the very traces of the passages of Michelangelo's or any other artist's presence. So the work becomes the full expression, almost the transfer of the artist onto the material, which is unheard of. In fact, there are parts that you may even think, well, but it's not polished, it's not finished. How come that this work was highly regarded? Because indeed, and that was the novelty, audiences, the gifted people, for instance, in this case, P.T., they were not searching for what was obvious, a clear representation of St. John. But it was, and he was able to grasp and to value Michelangelo's representation of St. John. Just think about yourself. If you were to have, accidentally, you were just crossing the streets in Salem, and there is you are, of course, in 1950s, so let's go backwards, and you were crossing the street, and then you acknowledge, oh, look at that guy, looks like a very well-known artist, a certain Pablo Picasso, and then he offers you a coffee, and in the meantime, he scratched something in a paper. Would you care whether it is an apple or a Madonna, whether it's a banana or it's Picasso's own gestures, hands, and traces, right? Invaluable. And that's exactly the beginning of that. So when Michelangelo is going not to finish, not to complete, leave it in a progress, in an ongoing manner, it is absolutely stunning and new, because the work is not something that you do, that you make, but it's something that it's constantly being done, being made. And it changes. In fact, what does it repeat? The very same forms that Michelangelo uses in preliminary drawings. He makes drawings with that same kind of hatching parallels, as if he is trying to look for the carved form that emerges. Very modern. It looks like a pre-Picasso, indeed, pre-Cubist, if you will. But what he does, he preserves the freshness, the immediacy of the project onto and within the final work. So the final work is never going to be signed or dated. Michelangelo has signed only one work, and the work that somehow was the forerunner of all these, the Pietà in the Vatican. In that work, he signs his name, the date, but more importantly, he uses a Latin expression that was not very common. Usually artists, painters, even architects, once the work was finished, they would write their names, Merisius, Pinxit, or Fecit. Made it. So it is, I made it, it's a certificate of authenticity, it is done. You pay me now, right? Or I could give you. In the case of Michelangelo, he's not going to use the past tense. I did it, I made it. He's going to use the imperfect, facebat in Latin, which is untranslatable in English because we don't have imperfect, but for those who know Spanish, French, Portuguese, any Romance languages, hacía, faceva, faisait, entrant, so something that is still ongoing. He is making it, or he was making it, as if it continues over time, endlessly. And in fact, he is going to somehow capture the ongoing process. The work is not a formed form, but it's a forming form. For you to perceive the very dynamics, the vitality, what makes us alive. The fact that we change, the fact that we move, the fact that we breathe, the fact that we are ongoing beings. That's exactly the ultimate goal of Michelangelo. Not imitate nature, but gives life a process. Capture the vitality of life, which is very different. And sometimes it has to be indeterminate because it is ongoing. We don't know what's going to happen, so he comes up with an expression that he's going to write about. Many poems by Michelangelo, they're going to talk about the work, life, existence as a non finito project. Not unfinished, not finished, purposefully left to a degree that creates this understanding that something is emerging, is happening, and shall be happening forever. There is no final destination but the process itself. So not finished is an elegy of indetermination. And the forms themselves cannot be shaped up and can be confined because life changes. And the work of art needs to create the same kind of perspective, ongoing project. And this is going to invite us to reflect upon. Because of course, many audiences, not only contemporary Florence-based people, but nowadays, I heard comments, that's one of my favorite sports. I don't do trekking, but I go to museums and I stand still next to a work to listen comments. And some of them, they are just here, oh my God, the guy hasn't even finished the work. But this looks like a sketch. It's a draft. Precisely, but in the draft, you see the potential of growth. You still see hope and future. It's contained, it's not fully expressed because it's constantly re-expressed. And that's the very point. So it is a reflection. That's the reason the works by Mannerist artists, they're not something for you to look at, but it's an invitation for you to reflect upon. You feel provoked, sometimes in a way that it's not comfortable, but they invite you also to consider the possibilities of the work themselves. So it is a meta-reflection. You think about what is it that is so unique about making a painting, making a sculpture, making architecture, making what we value so highly, rightly enough, as art. That's the beginning. Not the purpose or the subject represented, the Madonna, a devotional piece, so for people to pray before, fair enough. But alongside, simultaneously, you can appreciate what? This very artistic value. That's what makes this work so modern indeed. So modern that you are going to find equivalents. Look at the very famous self-portrait, an exercise of personal reflection. Vincent van Gogh. What is it so peculiar about Van Gogh? He builds his image. He expresses something, he grasps something, and he needs to find those very fragments of light, color, etc. to somehow express his emotions, but also this very construction of the self. And in fact, here, look at the way he leaves so much of the canvas, of the panels, absolutely untouched. Empty, broken. The vocabulary is not canonical. It is the, I would say, 19th century version of licenza. And you are not going to consider that an unfinished. It is not finished. He didn't want to fill with pigments or colors. He didn't need to express what he had in his mind. And just to conclude this very first section of our meeting, so I see equivalences here in this new form that somehow requires, positions the viewers differently, to the point that when you're looking at something like this, very contemporary, it is 1989, it is the very last painting, but a brilliant American artist, Keith Haring. And this is in fact, interestingly called the unfinished painting. We do know that Keith Haring, he completed the unfinished painting just a few months before his death. And if you look attentively, you're going to find the very distinctive features and elements of Keith Haring's vocabulary. At first in New York subways, and then in art galleries, and then murals in Pisa, Florence itself, right across the bridge where the Uffizi are located. You can find a mural painted by Keith Haring in 1988. So right before his death as well. And usually he would cover up the entire surface with a very uniform color, and then he would add, like a fabric, some traces in black, in white, in different colors. Here, he left the canvas, as if the form and the very dripping, they are marking the process. It is finished as an unfinished experience. And unfortunately, indeed, it is a metaphor for his very death, which is the death of a person, but not the death of the artist. And the work itself is here open up for meta-reflections. So I would like to conclude it here, the first half of our meeting. So we have our 15-minute break, and then questions that I would love to answer. Let's keep them for the very conclusion after the second half. Thank you. Can you hear me again? Welcome back then. Just to resume where we left, I would like to make a quote and to let Michelangelo's own voice to be heard. This is one of his most known poems in which he describes, in fact, this creative process as something that is intellectually driven and then, of course, manually executed. So the expression is fully achieved whenever it follows, or in his language, obeys the intellect. Non ha l'ottimo artista alcun concetto che un marmo solo in sé non circoscrive col suo soverchio, e solo a quello arriva la man che obbedisce all'intelletto. There is to say, the best artist does not have any concept, any idea, that a marble in itself does not circumscribe within its parts. And to that arrives only the hand that obeys the intellect. So it is very clear that the creative process is first and foremost a mental process, something for you to think about and then for you to express visually in any different media that you might want. And in fact, one of such a media has been arguably the most famous of all paintings by Michelangelo, the ceiling decoration, and then the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. Well, the Sistine Chapel, this is a print showing what might have looked like the Sistine Chapel when it was made in 1481 by Pope Sixtus IV. Hence, Sistine Chapel. The ceiling was decorated only with a blue lapislazuli in stars represented in gold, the two most expensive pigments, lapislazuli in gold, and the constellation shows the distribution of the stars in the night in which the Pope was born. So, of course, it was somehow the inner possibility, it was already a gift from God. Well, Michelangelo is going to change that quite drastically. He's going to receive, indeed, one of the most compelling, ambitious commissions. It is a sort of an encyclopedia of devotional practices. To tell it a biblical image is just too reductive because it goes far beyond. It is a set of forms that constantly invites us to somehow unite and reunite the dots. So the narratives, the implications from a religious, theological, moral standpoint, they are endless indeed. Almost like a game of permutation. And this, of course, is associated with the mastery of Michelangelo's in the human anatomy, something that I explained. It is not only the repetition of a certain canon, for instance, an image of the antiquity, such as the very famous Belvedere torso. It was imitated, copied, studied by thousands of artists, including Michelangelo. But what Michelangelo did is a form of transformative citation. While you can see here, as a sort of a permutation, the same prototype seen from different angles and thus interpreted differently. So the originating form gives origins to endless possibilities, thus creating something that it's no longer antique or Renaissance, but more the expression of Michelangelo's own manner. And here, for instance, undeniably, he paid attention, studied the muscle of the original 2nd century before Christ statue, and then, of course, translated into his pictorial vocabulary. But what Michelangelo was not expecting, certainly, is that his very prototype in the Sistine Chapel would become in turn the origin of another Michelangelo's explorations. And indeed, there is a chain of disrupted continuity and discontinuity, because here you have an interpretation by the second Michelangelo of our narrative today. We have one of the earliest works by Michelangelo Merisi, aka Caravaggio. And it is a representation of Saint John the Baptist. And of course, to this day, many Catholics in particular, of course, the audience that was the one for this painting, they are almost disturbed by the image because, of course, it is so blunt, raw in the representation of the human body as an actual body. There is no attempt of idealization. There is nothing that doesn't look like reality itself. Now, paradoxically, because in those years that Michelangelo Buonarroti had transformed Renaissance into something more personally expressive, expression has prevailed. And therefore, some late Mannerists, they are going to create works that they are just so inventive as not to resemble natural forms at all. And that was exactly what Caravaggio wanted to reassess, to revise. If I am going to stress so much the inventiveness, well, I'm going to be losing also the vitality of nature itself. And more importantly, nature does not coincide with reality. I want the paintings to look real more than natural. There is to say also with connotations that could be even socially placed and not only morphologically naturalistic. So it is a very interesting point that he's going to represent. If we could turn a little bit down off the lights, because those are very dark. Oh, I see, that's okay. Can you still see Caravaggio? Because of course, ideally would be in a black, dark room, because of course, the contrasts are just so sharp for you to see the highlights areas and the darkness of the background. Well, look at the face. No antique, no idealization, no Vitruvian canon at all, but more importantly, and even more problematically, the body. It has been represented in a way that it's so tangible, fleshy, as it has been described by early biographers. It is too carnal, too corporeal. The body has no filter, no decorum. It is just blatantly real, problematically, in fact, obnoxiously real. For what reason? Because, of course, it doesn't look venerable, respectable, but just an actual boy with dirt, broken toenails. Now, would you imagine a saint, venerable, respectable, someone that you are going to pray before in such a way? No. But again, that's the very novelty here. What Caravaggio does, he uses a very realistic mode of expression, new in that time, to represent forms that are just too well-known. Stories from the Bible, from mythology, but of course he knew that he was breaking the very important paradigm of what is appropriate. Decorum is one of the guiding principles of Renaissance art. Anything made by Raphael, Leonardo, including Michelangelo, even the most new and absolutely anti-canonical forms by Michelangelo, they don't break the decorum. They are still within the boundaries of what is respectful, appropriate for certain venues, for certain audiences, for certain placements. So if I were to imagine this in a public church, in a chapel, to be the object, not of an artistic contemplation, but of a devotional experience, that would have been really problematic. And in fact, Caravaggio knew it. And that's the novelty of his approach. He was creating a painting that although it is, as a subject, devotional or religious, it was not intended to be displayed publicly in sacred holy places, but in collections. So that's really new. we were just talking about how the market of art can manipulate the transformations of taste and even the value of artworks. Well, here we have something absolutely new. In Rome, the art market was just so vivid that we have collections, for instance, that could be called contemporary, in that they were no longer collecting pieces from sarcophagi, ancient statues, remote classical forms. No, the current ones. And interestingly, as I'm going to say in just a few seconds, Caravaggio has had as many praised works as rejected ones. He's the first artist whose list of rejected works is going to be indeed superior to the accepted ones. He was very troublesome, to say the least, and very poorly considered amongst the highest ranks of the Catholic Church. But certain ranks, indeed, he was equally favored, promoted, and sponsored, and more eagerly collected than any other. To the point that, for instance, certain paintings are going to be rejected in the churches where they were displayed for sometimes 2 days, because of course they were anti-decorum and they were just breaking the rules of a devotional piece. But then in the 3rd day, instead of being thrown away or destroyed, they were kept, bought, and displayed in private collections. And sometimes the nephew of the popes and the cardinals who had rejected the publicly displayed work, they're going to pay astronomical amounts of money to possess them. That's the reason why we have this absolutely mesmerizing collection called Villa Borghese in Rome. And what a coincidence! Who was the pope in those years? Paolo Borghese. So the pope indicated the works for being publicly unacceptable, but privately absolutely stunning. And that's a novelty. And that's the beginning of a new modern approach to art. Even the ones that are going to break the decorum, they can still be, and in fact they're going to be even more valued as a unique piece of provocative thoughts, of groundbreaking, boundless possibilities. And Caravaggio indeed had a first-hand experience in this commission. In the church that was protected by the French nation in Rome. Rome is a cosmopolitan city. In every neighborhood from the 13th century, they used to be pretty much like small colonies. So you would have the neighborhood of the Spanish, of the Portuguese, of the French, of the Dutch, and to this very date, some of the streets, some of the squares, they are named after this. And this is the church of Saint Louis of the French people, San Luigi dei Francesi. Here, Caravaggio was literally living across the street, protected by a cardinal who adored this kind of disruptive new work, but he knew that Caravaggio would have no chance at all going public, becoming an artist for commissions, for devotional purposes. And yet he tried. And through influence, he talked to the members of the chapel that was going to be built in this church, convinced the French Cardinal Quantrell that, oh, this guy is really unique. You're going to love his works. And Caravaggio received his first public commission. It is a major deal for an early modern artist, and I would argue even a contemporary artist. If you are going to receive, say, a public commission for the UNESCO in Paris, or for the NATO, or for the ONU, of course, it becomes an instrument of visibility. And accordingly, the market is going to react in different directions as well. Your prices are going to rise above the sky. So did Michelangelo Merisi from Caravaggio. Now, this might have resulted pretty much like, I don't know, a cold water shower to all local audiences. Because, of course, in the Contarelli Chapel, at this stage, in the very transition between the 16th and the 17th century, we have, for the very first time, paintings displayed in a place instead of frescoes made in that very place. So in other words, we don't have something that is painted on the walls, and it has been traditionally since the 12th century in Rome as well as elsewhere. So Caravaggio, here he's going to represent Trina, the most beloved life of St. Matthew, and here indeed he's going to do that in such a way that even if you're exceedingly familiar with the text, you're going to be surprised. And that's the point. Now, can you imagine how many times have you read or told the Snow White story, or Cinderella, or Sleeping Beauty? Well, if you're going to try to interact with your nephew, or with your niece, or if you are going to change to make it a tastier, a provocative, something sparkling, right? So you're going to introduce new characters, and that's exactly in a different dimension, of course, that artists are trying to do, especially in publicly commissioned works. This is not only intended to be there, to be contemplated, but to activate the whole series of devotional practices, the urgency of praying. So it is more of a mnemotechnique, something that stimulates our memory, our feelings. Caravaggio made something unique. If you compare this very architecture with any other, it's new in that the paintings, for instance, they are, if you observe here, they are highlighted and illuminated as if the actual source of light allows the natural light to come, and therefore to literally enlighten or get darker the characters. They are literally following the same direction from here. Nowadays, for conservative reasons, they closed the window. But if you think about 1600, there is no electricity, only candles and torches. Well, of course, light was a major point. But what Caravaggio wanted was to emphasize almost the theatricality, the reality of your perception of the darkness of the chapel is in the painting. So the painting is not some kind of pantheon or Olympionic golden age era. No, it is real as your own life. That would increase a form of relatability. You would relate to the images in a way absolutely with no precedence. And Caravaggio knew it indeed. And yet, if you compare to Renaissance works, you are going to see how striking it is. This is a chapel dating back the 16th century, fully colored with very idealized angels, and of course with fresco. When Caravaggio showed his own project, well, Contarelli, the commissioner, might have been surprised indeed. And even more surprisingly, he accepted. Just then too rejected the work. This is the first version of St. Matthew literally listening to the angel while the angel is recollecting all facts associated with the life of Christ. He's writing the gospel, right? And because it is a metaphysical entity, he's listening to a heavenly archangel. Look at the black and white. Because unfortunately, this work that was first painted by Caravaggio, the immediately delivered work, and as immediately rejected work, it was sold by a local art collector, Vincenzo Giustiniani, who is going to write pages and pages and pages of reflection about the arte moderna. He's going to use arte moderna, or modern art, as a term, because he knew that those works were too new. New for what? Unfortunately, as I mentioned, we have only a black and white, low-quality reproduction of the painting, because it was bought, it was rejected immediately, so the monks and the Contarelli commissioner didn't want the work, but then Giustiniani bought it immediately, brought it to the palace right across the street in his own private gallery, but unfortunately in the 18th century, to pay a few debts, he sold part of his collection to the then King of Prussia, Frederick III, and it moved from Rome to Berlin, where in 1945 it was indeed completely destroyed. Unfortunately, along with many, many other works. I don't know how many of you have been recently to the Staatliche Museum, or the Museum of the State in Berlin. It is a wonderful experience, but there is a most heartbreaking room ever. The room that they devoted to all destroyed works in 1945. Some of the works, they were preserved and kept because, of course, they were afraid that bombs were going to be thrown, and therefore they kept in boxes, in containers, moved away from the museum. Caravaggio, he was not considered Raphael at all. The fame of Caravaggio is going to resume he's going to be seen as a worth-preserving artist after World War II, when the first exhibition is going to be made at Museo Uffizi in Florence in 1950. Prior to that, if you happened to be in Rome in 1948, you could have bought Caravaggio for $15 in a thrift store, because he was neglected. He was far from being considered a worth artist. And by the way, Michelangelo himself, the Michelangelo Buonarroti too, he had a very poor fortune, for instance, during the 17th and 18th century. When I was writing a guide for a church in Rome made by Pope Pius IX, one of the earliest churches built by the Pope right before the unity of Italy, I found a letter in which someone writing around 1860 was condemned Michelangelo, saying, "Era meglio che non fossi." It would have been better if he had never existed. Because the guy ruined our art, breaking the decorum, breaking the rules, the canon. I want the canon. Well, he couldn't find it here. So unfortunately, this is in the Berlin Museum, all lost artworks that were not considered worth preserving back then, including Michelangelo, Caravaggio, and many the so-called Baroque masters as well. Be as it may, what is it that is so strikingly new about that? Everything, from the pose to the expression, from the relationship between the Archangel and St. Matthew. First of all, St. Matthew is represented as an exceedingly humble figure, barefoot, no venerable form at all, and ignorant. He is not writing. He is literally, physically helped by the angel to write, as if he had no preparation whatsoever. He might have known some numbers as an accountant, but that's it, as a tax collector. So this was seen as irreverent. What about the feet? Broken foot, completely dirty. And of course, you must contextualize the painting. In the chapel, you would be looking at the painting starting from the feet because of the height. And you would be feeling almost as if they are going to literally walk over you. And there are no boots, indeed. So this became the signature of the new approach by Caravaggio, and of course it was rejected. Not to lose the commission, he found out a different version. He rethought his own forms in relation to the expectation of the commissioner. So he made something that it's a sort of a compromise. The figure of St. Matthew appears older, and therefore metaphorically more respectful, venerable. He is wearing the distinctive toga-like clothes of an ancient Roman, and therefore as an appropriate historical figure of a Roman Empire tax collector. And he listens to the archangel or the angel, but he's writing on his own. There is an autonomy. There is therefore a form of well-educated person. This is the second version of the inspiration of St. Matthew. The archangel here appears beautifully listing the points of the life of the Christ that he shall remember. But he's just suggesting. It's an inspiration indeed. This work was therefore accepted, and ever since it has been displayed in the same church, in the same chapel, alongside with the other one, the Calling of St. Matthew. This is strikingly disturbing for a 17th century audience. First of all, the location. Dirty, dark, humble. It looks like a poor-ranked restaurant, very popular. So this is no place for us to locate in a church the highly venerable figures of the Christ, St. Peter, and the future St. Matthew. Here we still have St. Matthew. And who is St. Matthew here? There are just so many people in the light. The darkness is such that I can't quite see. Even the figure of the Christ itself is half hidden here by St. Peter. And then, of course, after a while, as if you were in the darkness, you are going to literally see the light. And see the light is more than a metaphor. It's the very phenomenological description of the process. You're going to seek for and see the lights in Caravaggio's painting, and through the painted lights, you are going then to be enlightened. And you are going to eventually see that, oh, no, this is not the guy. In fact, if you look at the detail, this is a gesture that indicates someone else. So there is a vector, a vectorial, not only indication of who is St. Matthew, who, by the way, is not even aware of the presence of the Christ. He's counting the coins. It was so unexpected, the arrival, the calling of the Christ, that human to human, he's still there as a tax collector collecting taxes. Nothing else before the illumination. And in fact, the vector, it's not only the one of this figure, but also the very hand of the Christ, and more impressively, and that's the ultimate novelty, an external source of light that actually coincided with the window in which the chapel, that used to have in the chapel. So you have painted windows, but the actual light coming from external sources. And they're all showing the figure of St. Matthew, still unaware of the Messiah. And we do know that the hand, it's another masterpiece of citation. Does it ring any bell? Yeah. Right? I mean, if there is a hand that is notoriously handy, this is the one that comes here. So there is a rivalry. As in St. John the Baptist, Michelangelo wanted to assert his own identity in a highly competitive market of art in Rome. And the fame of Michelangelo was still at its peak. So I, the new Michelangelo, somehow I have to confront myself and I have to prove that I'm superior to the Michelangelo. I am the new one. And in fact, he quotes directly from the creation of Adam, undeniably. If you look at the detail of the hand, just enlarging, but again, let's not make the models obvious. Renaissance masters, they are going to quote quite literally from their models. No, I am going to shift the paradigm and literally transform something that could be still evoked, suggested, but not shown. And that's exactly the reason why he paid so much attention. And interestingly, Caravaggio had also something very, very new. No drawings at all. He is the only early modern artist of that level by whom we have literally no drawings. Not one, not two, none. He has never made drawings for one reason. He made the preliminary sketches while painting. So if you go and undertake a diagnosis of the canvases or panels through X-rays, reflectography, then you could see the multi-layered, literally the varnishes and the pigments and everything. And you're going to see that while there are very few mistakes, for instance, the head was slightly larger, and then during the painting process, he changed it, he corrected. But the only striking modification that we have is in the very figure of the Christ in the hand. It was far clearly indicating this is the future St. Matthew. So what you're seeing here indicated in white, those are the so-called pentimento, or regrets. Preliminary solutions that the artist, during the process, changed and altered completely. So by the end of the day, you have this composition. Interestingly, so this church remains as a patrimony in which those two Michelangelos fuse together, melt together, but also they promote a new ideal in a new identity of art. Art that it's not only related to certain places, such as churches, but become a collectible item for other forms of appreciation and contemplation. But then again, there is something important for us to understand. How come that Caravaggio was equally accepted and rejected? Doesn't it sound like a contradiction, a lack of consistency? If you do have a certain taste, well, then pursue it, right? Defend it. So how could we explain? Well, we tend to oversimplify categories, right? As I mentioned about Renaissance, Baroque, and another very misused from a historiographical standpoint category is the church, the Catholic Church. In fact, it's far more nuanced and complex, historically speaking, than we may read in certain descriptions, including the fact that we have so many different directions and many different interpretations and approaches, including the ones that are going to promote somehow a revival of the authentic life of the Christ. poverty. And therefore, a return of the original church, a return to the very message of the Messiah, not living in fancy clothes, not promoting, indeed, parties or rich banquets, but a poor, humble, respectful life. And that's exactly what is going to be at the major point of debate around 1517, so 100 years before. Here in this cathedral, we have something truly revolutionary. A monk, an Augustinian monk, belonging to the very same order of the current Pope, Leo X, right, the 14th, the first American Pope. Here, this Augustinian monk went to Rome, and while visiting the city, he was just appalled by the misuses, abuses, the indulgences, and whatnot. He came back, and indeed, in Wittenberg, in the cathedral, the former Augustinian monk, Martin Luther, he started what shall be called the Reformation. And here, indeed, in this very cathedral, he exposed the so-called 95 Theses against many dogmas, but also many rituals and practices that were being perpetuated by the 16th century Catholic Church. So this critique is going to have so many implications that for the first time in many centuries, the very hegemony of the Catholic Church had been questioned, undermined. They were no longer the all-powerful source, but they could be questioned, even criticized in a harshly way. Alongside with this theological, dogmatic reformation, there will be also social reformations going on. And many events in those reformations are going to lead to movements of iconoclasms. Since 1522, first in Germany, then in the Netherlands, and in many other areas, we are going to have so many destruction. People are going to invade churches and literally burn down items from devotional pieces, statues, manuscripts, etc. And this is going to become so serious a tendency, a wave of iconoclasm, as they're going to call the Bildstorm, or the storm of destruction, that in the Netherlands, for instance, as well as in current Belgium, we made a calculation according to the archives. For instance, the works on Catholic churches that had been commissioned prior to 1522 or 1566, and if this calculation bears any reality, nearly the 80% of the artworks had gone completely destroyed during 1522 and 1566 waves of iconoclasm. And the very need of images has been questioned. Luther is going to be very diplomatic, but Calvin and many other congregations, they are going to be very blunt, and I'm talking about 16th century congregations, not the 21st ones. And in fact, they made it a point, for instance, against images. Images are distractful. Images, they are disturbing. You have nudity everywhere. So what's the point of having images? The Catholic Church is going to respond to all those questions by organizing an 18-year-long council in which the most important ranked priests, cardinals, they are going to gather in towns such as Trent, and then moving around for 18 years to talk about religious practices, rituals, problems within the church, etc. This is going to be known as the Council of Trent. In a publication that is over 15 volumes long, they have reestablished the norms, the roles, the dogmas of everything associated with the Catholic Church. And in the very last session, in 1563, they decided and they talked about images, artworks. Are they to be favored? Are they to be sponsored or neglected altogether? What is our position? Well, they're going to come up with 4 very meager solutions. First of all, every image must be text-based. It must follow the scripture. It must be biblically or any other officially recognized text. That it has to be faithful. Then, more importantly, they have to be instructive. There is a pedagogical end here. Images, they are not replacement of divinities or heavenly figures, but they are the gateways for you to reflect upon for pedagogical, instructional reasons. Then, of course, they have to be very plain and simple. not those convoluted forms, and let alone the manner. The manner is going to be harshly criticized. I no longer intend to promote the inner manner or the expression of an individual. I need clarity. I need the message. So manner and anything that is complicated is going to be forbidden. And the fourth point, no nudity at all. Anything that could be blameful and indecent shall be erased, to the point that Michelangelo has been the first victim. And in fact, the Last Judgment, all nudes, they wanted to destroy, but because it was already so famous, and Michelangelo died in 1564, a year later, the end of the council, we were this far from losing Michelangelo forever. But we didn't. But what the church decided was to promote a triumphal church, not a church that was at risk, threatened by the Reformation, but the Counter-Reformation needed to proliferate parades, everything that would clearly express the richness, the power, the vitality of the church. Hence, they are going to promote a style that shall be known as Baroque, something that is overwhelming, something that is clearly rich, and it's so rich that you may lose track of yourself. You are subordinated to the authority of those who are representing those images. This is a very, very good example of what the Catholic Church is going to promote, and with all the falling angels and all this myriad of characters, including the transfiguration of the name of Jesus, triumph, apotheosis, those are going to be the titles. Michelangelo da Caravaggio, he's going to have a very, very different tendency. On the opposite, he's going to prefer everything that it's downward, that it's discreet, that it's humble, that it's poor, that it's genuinely real. He's going to be, therefore, such as here in the Madonna of the Pilgrims or the Madonna of Loreto, it's a center of pilgrimage in Italy, he's going to represent two very poor pilgrims literally praying to the Virgin. But the Virgin doesn't look idealized at all. In fact, she's going to be described by the early biographer of Caravaggio as a scandal, because apparently, and we have reasons to believe, Caravaggio used actual models, they posed before his eyes while he was painting. And he used a prostitute, a well-known prostitute, in many paintings depicting the Madonna. So of course there was a clash of ideals here. And more importantly, if the Madonna herself doesn't look ideal, and Jesus doesn't look heavenly at all, even the halo is unclear, he is not going indeed to embrace the dictate, the rules of the Council of Trent. He's going to be favored by those parts of the Catholic Church that are going to promote, in fact, the revival of the Church to its humble, poor roots. And this is part of a movement called pauperism. Franciscans, Augustinians, instead of paying for Baroque masters to create all those overwhelmingly rich, golden painting, fancy clothed forms, they're going to prefer something that's straight to the point, real, realistic, but humble. So the experience of the devotion is going to be very different. You're going to reflect upon the very origins and the actual life of the Christ, not of the triumph of the church. So that's the reason why Caravaggio, he was accepted by a few members within the Catholic Church, while he was never accepted by the other ranks. And that's the reason why, indeed, I think that both Michelangelos, they have set new rules, new norms, new directions for art that are no longer just related to the history or the context they lived in, but we could learn some lessons from them. Humbly, but we could. Well, thank you all for your attention, really. And we do have time for questions.
Hello, Mike. This is Mark, and my question is a continuation of my question about the banana. It's on, but...
It's a little low, yeah.
Yeah. So we spoke about it in the break, and you asked me to restate it now.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about expressionism and how there were no limits on the artist and their creative power. And I propose to you that there are limits in the sense that the patron can dictate the limits of the extreme, because if the patron doesn't accept it, and there were two patrons even for Caravaggio, but if there's no one that will buy it, then
But that's
this
an
is not
interesting
art.
question
And
in that...
just to
sorry.
add to it, the banana thing is a complete con job, absolute con job, because it's a coordinated action between the artist and the buyer.
Let me then answer the question using current models, modernos, not the banana, because some of you may have lost the reference. Well, it's very true. There is always this connection to an audience, right? I keep saying to my students, while it is indeed the expression of someone, it is also the perceived expression by someone else. Art is always a communication process. And it's true, sometimes depending on the equation, there might be an unbalanced power. So I pay, and therefore I require certain forms. If I am going to buy a painting, my taste, my preferences, my ideologies, they're going to be there in my choices, right? And if I am the representative of an institution, that could be the church, city halls, the Capitol building, etc. Well, of course, depending on the political wave, depending on the ideological construction, we are going to have favored and neglected. But the point, interestingly, that I think is here, with Michelangelo, and more importantly, with Caravaggio, we have the dilation and the multi-layered purification of the market. True, a patron doesn't want me to cross the line. If I did, well, I have other patrons. Art is a pluralistic system. So it's very true, there are limits here and there, but on the other hand, that's why the market is so heterogeneous and global, worldwide sized, because I have different venues. In fact, then it will be interesting to see, sociologically speaking, the preferences. Why is it that if you go to Seattle, you're going to see certain forms of art that you shall not in other states, right? If you go to Italy, you're going to still have preferences associated with a certain historically 17th century located forms instead of others. So it is true, there is this mechanics of interaction with the patron, but also a multiplicity of patrons and markets too. So while you dislike the banana, someone ate it after paying 30 millions, right? Was that a, yes please? Oh, the telephone is migrating. Oh, I won't forget it.
Thank you, Professor. This is Bob. My question really relates to the novelty idea that the Renaissance was a period of great novelty. You've emphasized that at the beginning. And I have a lot of different things going on in my head, and so I'll try to make this question coherent. And it's the link between the recovery of the past, which is not necessarily novelty at all, but it's the introduction of the past that is novel. And the forms, the images, are presenting more and more ordinary people in ordinary situations.
In the case of Caravaggio.
So, was there, I'll start with this piece. Was there a link between the society in Italy, northern Italy, between who those people were that were wealthy and buying these paintings, and a sort of a tacit social revolution? In other words, we are important, and we're going to show our importance in the kind of people you're going to see in those images.
There is a wonderful English expression that I really think facilitates the understanding of this historical phenomenon: patronizing, which is very difficult to translate in any other language, right? You becomes the patron, even if you're treating the person as if she, he, or they were the patrons, right? You're patronizing indeed. That's exactly the dynamics here. Very true. We did have in the past, and Caravaggio in that sense is not the absolute novelty, in which humble people, shepherds, for instance, peasants, they are going to be not only painted, commissioned, but also profoundly collected, such as Peter Bruegel, because they represent the other, the different, the diverse. So by collecting those people, I am also somehow marking my social separation. I admire their originality, their peculiarity, but I'm very far from following their lifestyle. Very true. So here, however, we do have something slightly different. Because in the case of Peter Bruegel, for instance, we do know, and I apologize if I don't have images, just you imagine 16th century peasants vomiting, dancing, etc., etc. Well, they were favored by specific patrons and art collectors that ranked between the very high bourgeoisie and aristocracy. In the case of Caravaggio, what we're going to have is a local market that is no longer based in this social differentiation. We're going to have, indeed, reproductions of Caravaggio-looking works in prints that could be afforded and bought by people who are not necessarily rich. So there will be a difference in the social aspect of Caravaggio's revolution, I would say. He is going to represent poor, destitutes, and humble people for people who are going to somehow, I would say, even neglect their own legacy, say if they were rich people, to embrace the new address, the new orientation of pauperism. We know, for instance, that many future saints of the Catholic Church, they are going to follow Caravaggio's message, and they're going to promote this very notion of living life as Christ did, without any possessions. So even if they were born as rich people, they are going to literally give up of their goods. So it is very different as a social, I would say, reassessment.
Hi, this is Cassia. I have always been puzzled when looking at religious art from this period of time that you've been talking about the depiction of the Christ child, which always seems to me to be non-realistic in the child itself.
Are you talking about this version?
This one is fine. This is a good example of that. Mm-hmm. That child seems to be totally out of proportion with the rest of the picture. And we'd have no idea how old that child is, but presumably in many of the other religious works, the infant is an infant, like just born, and it's huge like that. Is there some kind
and
of...
there are reasons for that.
Okay, that's the question.
And I wish I had other images to show. There is, for instance, a very recurrent symbolic trope or a visual code for which the boy, the kid, the child, they are simultaneously very real or naturalistically done. So you can see that there is a child, but they look older, larger, as if the body is somehow the announcement of a future development. So it is somehow a symbolic container of other stories, of other moments. There is one expression in Latin, puer senex, the old child. And especially in 15th, early 16th century paintings, you may look at the body of the child full of wrinkles, but not the fluffy wrinkles that you would have expected. Dried, meager, indeed wrinkled in areas that are not the ones that you would be, waiting for the development of the body itself, but as if they are going to be dried up. And wrinkles in the eyes, the hair is blonde, almost straw-colored. Can we? There is a resemblance, right? So in other words, it's a way to... Can you hear me all now?
They can't pick
Is
it
that
up.
all right?
No.
They can't pick it up in the
So
video.
let me try again, hopefully.
It's getting
Yeah.
rid of the speaker.
So if I'm here,
Yes, good.
fine, right? It's better. So should I move forward? Here?
The speakers in the ceiling.
Like a fresco. I could be suspended like a Baroque speaker. No, seriously. So let me just put it here, or else it's going to be a little too complicated. What was the question again? The baby, the puer senex. So indeed, some of the images, they are to be somehow relatable, so they look realistically enough to create that kind of empathy. It is a cute baby, but at the very same time, you're going to notice that beyond the realism of the baby, there are some tropes such as wrinkles, the skin, that it's textured, the pale color, everything that evokes, suggests what's going to be happening to that baby in particular. He's not just a baby, he's the Christ, right? So those are symbolic devices. So very often they are going, and this is a form of visual construction that Michelangelo, on the other hand, you are all aware of the creation of Adam, right? It's a gigantic body with the tiniest penis ever, because indeed it is the reverse of the medal, because he is simultaneously an adult. In fact, he's the mankind, the first man of all mankind, but simultaneously a newly born baby. He's the first man in the very moment of the creation. To express that, Michelangelo, again, didn't have a very established code. He had to come up with visual metaphors. And as always, metaphors, they are as clear as they may be obscure. So the body is there, and people, because of course they touch upon certain taboos, such as sexuality, gender, we refrain from addressing the points. There are very few scholarly publications on the topic. But that's the reason why, for instance, the nudity that the Council of Trent has so much debate about, well, it was allowed for the child, and not always, only when you were talking about the incarnation of the child. So he's the flesh, he's the body of the spiritual being. So it is a form of somehow conveying very expressive but very difficult to grasp concepts, abstractions indeed.
Hi, I'm Tom. First of all, thank you for a marvelous presentation.
Thank you.
Thoroughly enjoyed every minute of it. I guess my question is really a chicken and egg question, and that is that you've been pointing out how Caravaggio was really the man who, I don't know if he created chiaroscuro or whether he simply was the master of chiaroscuro, because it's a recurrent motif throughout all of his works. I guess my question, the chicken and egg question, is which came first? Chiaroscuro as an innovation in form and style by Caravaggio, or the agenda of the Council of Trent?
Now I regret that I literally cut 4 slides to make the comparison of the very first visitor of the Contarelli Chapel. We do have the rubric. When, of course, a work was rejected, it was not only the wishes of an individual, so it needed to be supported, motivated. And as such, we do have plenty of archive-based documentation of this group of people, including a local artist, Federico Zuccari, that may not ring any bell, but he was considered highly regarded at the time as the founder of the first Academy of Fine Arts in Rome. So of course he was the prince of the artists. And therefore, alongside with cardinals, priests, he was invited also to come along to visit the chapel and to decide whether the work should or should not be rejected. Interestingly, Federico Zuccari has reported that at the first sight of Caravaggio's painting, he called it, I don't know who is this guy, never heard of course, it was the first public commission, but he's certainly from Venice. He's a Venetian. Why? Because Venice was already very famous for Titian, Tintoretto. They didn't work through drawings. They painted directly on the canvas, on the frescoes. And therefore they are, if anything, known as the masters of chiaroscuro, the masters of color. Now, Milan, Caravaggio, while they are not geographically close, especially in 17th century to Venice, it would take 3 to 4 days to reach Venice, the works were known. For a certain master, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo worked in Milan, and he used a chiaroscuro in his first public commission it's pretty much pre-Caravaggio. It was not successful, harshly criticized, and therefore has no evolution. It stayed as a unique piece. Caravaggio might have seen their possibilities. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I guess my other part of the question was whether or not the Council of Trent used chiaroscuro theologically and ideologically to promote their cause of revitalizing the Catholic Church.
I would argue quite the opposite. They are going, in fact, to have a harsh time with that peculiar kind of chiaroscuro because it does embody reality in a way that it's not glamorous, it's not powerful. We want to promote an idea that this church is stable, strong, and it's in triumph. So they are going, in fact, more officially to embrace what shall be called Baroque. That's the reason why I have a whole class called Neoclassical and Baroque Visual Culture, and from day one, I keep talking to my students, while Caravaggio is very often associated with Baroque art, and so is Rubens, and they're just so different. So what is the term for? Why are we using Baroque? And in fact, Caravaggio is more well described as a realist. And the word realism has indeed been used in reference to Caravaggio. While Baroque is this ostentatious form of glamorous that you are going to see in Versailles, that you are going to see indeed in the papal court, etc., but not among pauperists. I see the microphone.
Hi, I'm Lisa. And I was just wondering about the unfinished work and whether or not they wanted to introduce the idea that there is no such thing as a perfection in art.
Absolutely. And I would say that this comes also with a kind of a religious connotation as well. Federico Zuccari, for instance, the prince of the Academy of the Fine Arts, he's going to praise drawing as the incarnation of the divine. In that, he's going to say that disegno, drawing, is sign of Dio, disegno, sign of God. So the artist is a demigod, and therefore they have this power of transforming and creating, to keep the distance and to make it very clear that they are humble artists, while the artist has created the world, fetch it, I can't. I'm but a pale shadow reflection, and therefore I'm still working on that. Absolutely. The paradigm of perfection has become a main target of art theory in 16th century. It was no longer a paradigm, nor beauty. In fact, beauty has been declassed as something that it's achieved, that could be measured. You could use canonical proportions to achieve beauty. So beauty is not the ultimate beauty. The ultimate beauty, according to those treatises, is grace, which shall not be measured. Raphael, for instance, was so highly regarded for 3 centuries, he's going to be praised not because of the beauty of his works, but the grace of them, which has, again, very important theological connotations, but also grace, according to the treatises, is the untraceable, unmeasurable other. Beauty can be determined 8 times the head. You have a beautiful proportional body. It is calculated. It is mathematically driven, not grace. So there will be a huge reflection. Again, those works and those artists, they are going to become thinkers more than anything, including the master of the banana. Any further questions? Oh, you see more than I do.
In your introduction, I'm Virginia. In your introduction, you mentioned that you were originally thinking about 4 Michelangelos. Who are the other 2?
Do you have 8 hours? I thought I wanted to create a sort of a symmetric counterpoint. So originally I thought of presenting Michelangelo Buonarroti, so the Sistine Chapel guy, with Michelangelo Antonioni, the film director, who happens to be also a brilliant visual artist. He's lesser known as an artist, a painter, but he does have a museum in Ferrara, and I wanted to explore. In all his works, they appear unfinished, all of them. And including, for those who are familiar with films by Antonioni, well, they appear open-ended. There is no ending. They are still to be told. What is the destination of the story? It shall be determined. So I wanted to, Michelangelo with Antonioni, and then Michelangelo Caravaggio with a contemporary Italian artist called Michelangelo Pistoletto, from the generation of 1970s, who worked literally with mirrors, representing people looking at mirrors on mirrors. And when you go to the exhibitions, it's tantalizing because they are not painted, they are reproduced, the photographs screened on the mirrors, so they are as realistically as it can be. And you look at people looking at people, and you don't know whether you are real or fictional. So it is, again, a very interesting development of this very notion of what is reality after all. When we're claiming that Caravaggio has reached a degree of reality, it is always metafictionality, right? It's always, the closer you get, the more you're going to see the fabric of the canvas, the brush strokes, of course. So it depends on how close and involved you get to the work. The closer it explodes, which is a beautiful sequence of one of the films by Michelangelo Antonioni. There is a brilliant film that was shot in England called Blow Up. Oh, I love when that happens because, of course, there is this frisson of sharing. And literally, it is a murder story. A photograph has been taken of someone who has committed a murder in a park with beautiful, stunning Vanessa Redgrave. And they have only a blurred picture of the murderer. And the more they're going to get closer and larger, the more blurred. So the closer you get to reality, the more ungraspable it appears, right? So I wanted to create this very continuity. But again, I thought that 6 hours were not enough. And next time we should go, I don't know, to Timber Lodge for a whole weekend from 6 to 6, and then we could have a full development.